Welcome to Facts Matter. I am Aton. This is Mookie. We wish you a happy new year. We got a really great present this morning when we woke up and saw the news that Claudine Gay has officially resigned from her position as president of Harvard. It's a little bit overdue when you're caught plagiarizing over 50 times on basically the entire breadth of your academia. You know, when you want to maintain your reputation as the greatest institution for education in all of America, possibly the whole world, you kind of have to let someone like that go. And I think that's what the bottom line was. That, and people pulling all their donation money and probably giving it to some other school that's more deserving. Now, let's get into a little bit about why this is important, and we're going to do that through the context of DEI and who Claudine Gay was, how she became president of Harvard. So when we look at her background, she's not from an underprivileged, upbringing. She went to a private boarding school. She basically had, more opportunities than I would argue most, white oppressors do in terms of, her access to education. So despite all of this, she still didn't technically meet the criteria that one would need to get into Harvard. She was let in through DEI, through the rules that they have concocted that basically says, well, this person is of this race, so we lower the bar for them and we let them get in based on, this criteria that we've set up, even though this criteria, it has everything to do with race and nothing to do about an individual's access to education, to all the things that really define whether someone has opportunity or not. And she had every opportunity that basically everyone has. So there was no reason for DEI to admit her, under these pretenses of, she was disadvantaged or something along those lines. So she gets in, and through the breadth of her academia, we find that she's plagiarized almost everything that she's written, all of the most important stuff, the thesis papers, the dissertations, all the stuff that really determines, whether you're up to snuff. All the stuff before, all the term papers and stuff, that doesn't matter compared to, your dissertation or your thesis, right? The most important body of work that she has, that is where the plagiarism is, and that is where the major problem is. So we look at DEI. What did DEI really accomplish by making Claudine Gay the first Black president of Harvard, right? I would argue that they, because of DEI's agenda and because of what it was willing to overlook, what it was willing to just turn a blind eye to, we see exactly how it unfolds. We see this on the border. We see this with our cities, turning into hotbeds of theft and violence and crime, right? It's like every idea that they had, it sounded good in its inception, but when you actually put it into practice, you see that DEI just fails everywhere, right? Even in big businesses, even when you're talking about, coalescing a team or a company like, Disney, where it can't even sell movies anymore because it's just basically selling something that nobody wants, and that's what DEI basically is proving to all of us. So when we take the concept of DEI, we take the concept of Claudine Gay. I mean, it's obvious why they didn't want to get rid of her right away. Why didn't they want to get rid of her right away? Because obviously that sends the message that, DEI did not work, right? Like when she's your poster child for DEI, and then you find out that, she doesn't meet any of the criteria necessary to be president of Harvard, it begs to ask the question, like, what was she even doing teaching in that school? What was she teaching in that school? How many other teachers are unqualified? How many other teachers, right, are not up to snuff? And it's probably a lot more than we realize, but that's not what we're really talking about here. So I want to get to what Elise Stefanik said when she said she's going to get to the moral rot that's at the core of this issue. And this deviates away from what we're talking about here and getting more into the George Soros, Black Lives Matter, Jewish Forces for Peace territory. And let me explain what kind of a theory that I have. And it is that there's a group of very, very powerful, influential politicians who, quite frankly, are experimenting with mankind. And what do I mean by that? Take the groups that George Soros funds like Black Lives Matter. And what are they doing? They have found, disadvantaged black people, and they have taught them this Marxist ideology that basically encourages them into violent socialism. And in how it's formed and in how it's structured, it's the type of entity where, based on the political climate, it becomes impossible to even hold Black Lives Matter to account when it riots in a city, when it is espousing violence. The message that it left after the October 7th attacks really says it all, right? It basically said, what did you think decolonization was really talking about? Right, when it was advocating for why October 7th should happen again and why it was justified. Makes you start to think that, hey, maybe these people are actually like okay with doing this to our own populations, right? If that's what the real core message is, and that's what they're saying they're really talking about, then maybe we should take them seriously and at face value. That's my opinion on that. And George Soros, he's kind of structured it perfectly in that, in our current climate, if you say anything bad about BLM or you say the kind of stuff I'm saying right now, they just label you a racist and, write you off, and they don't even need to talk to you or discuss these things. And it's a great system for basically having a cover for what your real agenda is. And we see the same thing in Jewish Voices for Peace. What do we see with Jewish Voices for Peace? We see a small, not small, but it's a Marxist organization filled with a bunch of crazy, white radicals, but a lot of people who are LGBTQ positive. And it basically found 7 Jews without a moral bone inside of their bodies who have likely been brainwashed through this ideology that's been around now for basically 15 years, 20 years in our education system. It's kind of just been like slowly kind of like permeating itself throughout it. And it's like it takes something like October 7th for us to really realize, wow, right? Like, how long has this brainwashing been going on? And how do we not really see it happening? And we go to, something like Jewish Voice for Peace. And when you have Jews who are literally anti-Zionist, right, who are literally like advocating for these groups that are trying to justify October the 7th in some way, and you say that, 7 of these people, because they're Jewish, they represent Jewish Voices for Peace, and the other, 993 members who are not Jewish, right? Like they're just somehow following the lead of these, very brave Jewish voices. When really, like let's say it for what it is, those Jews are a shield, those Jews are a deflection, those Jews are meant to make you think that this is actually a legitimate Jewish organization. Let's make a bunch of them leaders of this group, right? Like the president, this, that. And right away, you're just going to assume that, yeah, well, if all the leaders are Jewish, then clearly all of the followers must be too, right? I mean, that makes sense to me. So you look at like the structure of how, and like it's not just these 2 groups, right? You look at like the whole concept of like resegregation, right? And like what's going on with that, right? Where like you have all black dorms on universities now. You have graduation ceremonies that are strictly done by race, right? Unless you're white, then obviously it has to be fully inclusive. So it's really weird how they pick and choose and pick and choose, who gets these special rules, who gets those special rules. And, it's not like they have a chart for you to see, right? Or how they determined all of these things. So when you wrap that all up into a nice little bow for yourself, you know, you see that the hypocrisy in it, right? Imagine if people on Harvard were chanting for all the African Americans to go back to Africa, right? They were going to be chanting something that Malcolm X advocated and something that actually grew with some popularity among certain crazy deranged circles, right? So when you know what the answer to that would be, why is it then any different when people are calling for the Jews to literally be kicked out of our homeland? And not even kicked out. Let's be real about what they're saying. They're saying that we should be just killed, right? That we should be exterminated. That we are the colonizers. And that's the next issue I want to get to. I want to get into, what has been very cleverly interwoven as a narrative for people to buy into, which really at the core doesn't make very much sense, and I'll explain why. Most indigenous races, when you talk about an indigenous race, it's typically the people that come from that region. It's not the people that settled there later. It's not the people that ended up colonizing the region. It is the original indigenous peoples. Now, we all know that Jews were there before the Arabs. We know that Jews were there before Palestinians. We know that Jews were taken in 139 AD in exile, the Pharisees. That is the type of Jews that actually survived the purges. All the other sects were destroyed, especially the ones that actually sold Jesus out to the Romans. We are not those Jews. We are the Pharisees. So, based on this, fundamental understanding, we are the indigenous people. We are an anomaly to history because we did go to Europe, to Iran, to Iraq. We spread out all over the world. Some of us were in Ethiopia. So we spread out all over the world. And there is a link between us, and it's in our DNA. So DNA proves that just about every Jew has ties to the Levant, those of us with legitimate lineage. So if we all share a link with one another, and then we all share a link to the Levant, which is where Israel is, how are we not the indigenous people of Israel? Just because other peoples always lose their identity after they're forced to assimilate into other cultures, it doesn't mean that that automatically disqualifies our claims. Not when we have so much other evidence to back it up with. And it's not just our own book. The Roman historical accounts, the Persian historical accounts, they all speak about us, and all of their stories line up with what is in the Torah. So even if it is not a religious text, it is an accurate genealogical text in that it's almost like an autobiography of Israel and what the Jewish people accomplished up until the point that they were exiled. Let's move this let's take it another step forward. Let's understand that most cultures that have a designation as being, let's say, indigenous, they are people who have some harmonious connection to the land, especially those that are going to have a greater indigenous claim than another person who was born in the same country. Let me give you an example. Is a black man who was born in America, is he more American than a Native American who was born in America? I think, it's a rhetorical question. But the reason I'm asking for it is because you have to use that same analogy when you're looking at Israel, when you're really evaluating the Palestinian and the Israeli people. The Native Americans, they want to go back to a state that they were at before. They actually want to regress. They want to give up a lot of the advantages that comes with civilization. They'd still rather prefer to, dance over a fire pit than, let's say, dance in a well-heated dining hall. So there's a lot of these understandings that where it comes to most indigenous people who get these designations for special land for their own region, they're normally harmonious with their environment. I'll take that a little further too. They do not overpopulate their environment. They do not destroy their environment. They have found a way to kind of coexist in their region, and they don't really need to move or spread out to ever get more than what they need. Whether it's the Native Americans in Canada, in the US, or whether it's some of the tribal groups in South America and Africa, these groups are kind of the special designation groups. Now, I don't believe Palestinians should fall under this umbrella. And the clearest cut example is, number one, they have no issue with technology. They have no issue with basically having every amenity that everybody else has in a democracy, in communism, in whatever government system you want to call it. They are definitely pro-civilization and pro any new technology. All right, so we got to make that clear. The next thing about them, they come from a society that has lots of kids, that really they cannot be sustained generationally in one area of land. And that has to do with their Arab roots, their Muslim ideology, right? Their religion plays a big factor in this. The religion plays a big factor in the society. And the religion ultimately ties them into a group that we should refer to as Arab Muslims and not as Palestinians. because ultimately there's very little difference between them, except maybe a few regional traditions. So when you're really going to the extent of, this is this people's land, these people belong here, these people, this is all they need, all they'll ever want. It's not true, right? They've proven it's not true, because Gaza was always Gaza. That was a part of Egypt. Those people there, okay, they would have been able to, even when you took all the people from the Nakba and you put them in Gaza and you have 500,000, 700,000 of them, there was more than enough land for all of them, especially once they kicked all the Jewish settlers out. There was way more than enough land. When 2 million people is now really crowded, 700,000 should probably be just about right. So when you're considering that type of a society that is always going to eventually outgrow its means just through population and just through consumption of resources around it, it becomes very, very obvious that Palestine would require a global economy in our globalization market, and it cannot sustain itself as like an indigenous people that just strictly rely on themselves and have no need or function for the greater whole and need nobody else to assist them. So we got to take this a little further as well. We got to get into the legitimacy behind how progressive liberalism tells us that we are not allowed to judge another culture on its merits. Now, I normally would agree with this. I really would. But where I have an issue with this is strictly with Arab Muslim countries. And just Muslim countries in general, but really the Arab countries are where the most extreme interpretations of Islam come up, and they become societal issues. It's not just a religious issue, because when everybody follows the religion and has to, and you cannot leave the religion or be declared an apostate and basically be sentenced to death, it's not the same as religion in the way that we understand it, where we can pick and choose what we follow, when we want to follow. So let's make this clear that we cannot view it through that lens. So when we're viewing those countries, let's look at some of the things that they do that has nothing to do with religion, that may have a grounding in religion, but has been taken from religion and made into a societal cultural norm. Let's talk about the hijab and the niqab to start. Many people would think that these are mandatory, that Islam tells you you have to wear these. It does not. Now, it may suggest that you should wear them. It may hint that wearing it will help you reach greater divinity or be more pure, whatever, with God. But it in no way says that you have to or that other people have to. So let's make that clear right away. And then the niqab is taking that further, right? Those are like the women wrapped up like mummies, right? And the only thing that's forcing them to do that is their husband. Now let's go further about a husband and how much more important he is than a wife is in these countries. Every one of these countries, according to Sharia law, every woman only has half the worth of a man's testimony. Let's say you go to court. Let's say it's your word against a man. You technically actually need, if you're a woman, you need another woman to say what you're saying, just to even equal what the man is saying. You need at least two women validating your word to actually be worth more than a man. So just fathom that for a second, that this is a misogynistic culture. You cannot call that it isn't misogyny to value a woman at half. You just can't. So you have a misogynistic culture that takes it even further with the genital mutilation that's happening in places like Somalia, happening in the more, let's say, uncivilized parts of the Sunni world. Now, I'm pretty sure this doesn't happen in Shia Islam, but I know that for sure this happens in many areas of the Sunni world where young girls have their genitals mutilated before puberty. And I'm not going to get into too gory the details, but it's basically so that they can't get proper sexual gratification from their partner or even from themselves. And this in turn is supposed to somehow keep their minds clean and, make them good, humble, docile wives. If that isn't misogyny in its most purest form, really, I don't know what to say, right? I don't know how to respond to somebody who could argue against that point or try to tell me that it's not misogyny, because I have no right to judge someone else's culture. Now, we'll finish up with one last point. Arab Muslims will take converts. They gladly accept converts. Jews do not. We are not happy with converts. If you go back to, like, let's say 1850 or 1700 AD, you were some random guy who showed up at the Jewish village and said, hey, I'm a convert, even if you managed to pass all the tests required to become a convert, which is extensive. You have to know Hebrew better than I do. You have to know Torah better than I do. So even if you pass, which it takes about 2 years normally. So even if you passed everything that's required to become a convert, you would still be shunned in the Jewish community that you're trying to become a part of. You're still going to be seen as the outsider, as the not real Jew. You're still going to have very slim prospects for a wife, for any kind of a future in that community. Now, take it even another step forward. What advantage is there to being a Jew in 1700? What, to have my head chopped off? Right? Like what? To be part of some pogrom, to have everything taken from me, for me to be ran out of town, all because I'm a Jew? Like, I don't know this happened to my ancestors, like it keeps happening. Right? So this is type of the logical fallacy I see, where people try to say, well, the Jews, how do we even know they're Jews anymore? Well, we're Jews because there was no advantage not to be a Jew. If we can show our ancestry and lineage to, let's say, like the mid 1800s, you cannot argue that we're Jewish because there was no advantage to be a Jew, right? And you would literally, you would be killed if they found out that you are a Jew and you're pretending not to be a Jew. So really, it's like a catch, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Now, Islam gladly welcomes converts. Imagine a place like Palestine. Do you really think that there haven't been Muslims that just showed up at Palestine from Lebanon, from Egypt, from Syria, and didn't just say, hey, welcome me into your community, and they didn't just welcome them? Do you really think that they were like, hey, you're not one of us, you're not allowed here? Any Muslim is allowed. That's the whole concept of Islam, of this like Arab Brotherhood. That's kind of like the whole basis about what that is. They are all one. So if they are all one and they just gladly welcome one another in, how is this an indigenous people? When I know that the reserves here in Canada, if some white guy just showed up and said, hey, can I just live here? Yeah, okay. But that's literally what happens in Gaza. And it is like, yeah, welcome, come join us. Here, I have a daughter for you to marry. I imagine that's actually how they diversify their gene pools, is through stuff like that. But what I'm trying to explain here is that when this is a perceived indigenous people that should have a claim to the land, that are still somehow obsessing over a bad land deal from 75 years ago, when they're offered compensating lands, yeah, it may not be as good of a deal as you started with, but you also have to understand that the indigenous true owners of that place have returned, and they're asking for at least half. And that should be more than fair, especially when you consider how little they are asking for and how you technically come from an empire, from a collective brotherhood that is, 99.6%. Israel is basically 0.4% of that whole giant piece of pie that is already theirs. And they can't even let Israel have that 0.4%. All right. I think I've covered a great deal today. I think we've actually gone like a little too far. I think I've kind of gone like to a lot of tangents. I think we've presented a lot of information. I think it's maybe even a little chaotically interspersed, but I've kind of done my best doing this in one shot without cuts and cuts and cuts. I've kind of tried to show you kind of how it all links together in one continuous thought, let's say, or series of thoughts. So I would really love to hear what you guys think about this theory I've presented. Now, I want to take it deeper. I want to talk about how all of these thoughts and all of these teachings, they all really link into the whole concept of, progressive liberalism's idea that, there are colonizers, that they need to decolonize, there are oppressors, there are oppressed, and, how it all ties into, George Soros, Black Lives Matter, how it all ties into this great big, I guess you could call it conspiracy theory. but I like to call it an agenda within our government. And instead of using, where science uses mice as lab rats, psychology can only really use humans. There's no substitute for us in the field of psychology where it comes to, what can we practice with? What can we experiment on? So I will talk more about that in the next video. And we're done for today. Take care, guys. Have a great day.